problem isn't that you don't show up on camera. It's that you keep changing shapes whenever I try to photograph you.
Blah, 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 blah.
Oh, hey, everybody. Welcome to the Nerdy Photographer Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Fatchett. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, in addition to providing you with informative and entertaining photography-related information, I also go on adventures with the crew of the Starship Fibonacci. Right now, I'm trying to photograph Grand Duke Orlo, a vampire.
Space vampire. Blah, 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 blah.
Correction. Space vampire. For his intergalactic ID card, but he keeps changing into a bat.
Correction, you mean space bat.
This is what I'm dealing with, folks. Well, while I try to get a flattering shot of the Duke, you get to listen to our final spooky season episode for the year. And it's one that I'm very, very excited about. My guest is Dr. Emily Zarka, host of the PBS digital show Monstrum. Dr. Z and I discuss photographing monsters and why it seems so important to us as a society to try to get photographic or video proof of a monster's existence. All of that after the break.
Hey, I'm Dustin.
And I'm Steve.
And we host the Wedding Photo Hangover Podcast, a lighthearted look at the vast world of wedding photography.
That's what we're doing? I thought we were making a podcast about drinking beers, flying drones.
Did you even take yours out of the box?
Coping with your post-wedding hangover, social media etiquette, and wearing moon shoes.
They're not moon shoes, Steve. They're just...
But seriously, check us out if you want to have a laugh and learn a thing or two about shooting weddings and running a wedding photography business.
You can find the Wedding Photo Hangover Podcast on iTunes or wherever you get podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the Nerdy Photographer Podcast. I am your host, Casey Fatchett, and it is still spooky season here on the podcast. And I am so excited for the guest for this episode. I am joined by Dr. Zarka, who is the host of Monstrum on PBS Digital. Dr. Zarka, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're absolutely welcome. Can you tell our listeners might not be familiar with your show. I've watched your show. You tell them a little bit about it?
Absolutely. So Monstrum is an online YouTube show on the channel Storied, part of PBS, and I take a look at how human history is monster history. So every episode looks at a particular monster across any part of the world, and I do my research and try to get to the whys and hows of why the monster was created.
I honestly, this is like it speaks to me deeply because on a level of from being a teenager, the same sort of thing, like always being curious about different types of monsters and like what's the backstory and where did this come from, and our talking to one another all started on Twitter because someone was asking about in a Twitter thread about photographing vampires, and we had differing opinions on why you can't photograph a vampire. Like, I don't know, what you can tell me why you think a vampire can't be photographed.
So I think that the legend of why vampires can't be photographed comes from the popular belief in some vampire stories that they don't have souls. There's another variation where vampires can't be photographed because of the original exposure process involving silver back in the 1860s, I believe. But vampires weren't traditionally perceived as actually being capable of being harmed by silver. So I think vampires can't be photographed because they don't have souls is the stronger piece of folklore in my mind.
Okay. So, I mean, our disagreement there, it's a friendly disagreement here. Mine was the silver because it didn't have to do with like they were weakened by silver. It was in my research, what I had read was because of the purity of the metal and being an impure being, they did not show up in like mirrors because of the silver backing on mirrors or the silver that was used in photographs, which, if that was the case, then, you could photograph, vampires pretty easily now with digital photography because we don't use silver. But we're going to go with your logic. You're the expert. So by the same logic and rules of like not having a soul, what other monsters would, what would happen when you try to photograph other monsters? How about werewolves?
So werewolves, from my research, usually do have souls because they were once human or are human at the same time, right? That's kind of the dichotomy of the whole werewolf situation. So I would say, yes, werewolves can be photographed. Unless we are going with the silver, then they definitely can't. So that one gets a little muddy. Yeah,
but I can't look in a mirror to shave. So that's
right. No, I think so. Werewolves are can be photographed. Something like a mummy, though, if we're talking about Egyptian mummies, the ancient Egyptians believed that your soul goes to the afterlife or is eaten. So mummies could not be photographed.
Well, I mean, okay, so let's go with maybe like a Arthur Conan Doyle mummy. Like, but what happens when the mummy comes back? It's like, isn't it the soul of the spirit coming back? That point, like,
yes,
for vengeance.
That's true. So if the mummy was animated by the soul of the deceased, then they could be photographed.
Right. Okay,
that logic works.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure it out. Like, I'm trying to figure out the logic. And then zombies. We're like, I think it might depend on the type of zombies we're talking about.
Definitely,
because there are so many different zombie legends from around the world. But this brings me to ghosts. And I have so many thoughts and feelings on spirit photography of different kinds. And I've been on a ghost hunt. And there's just like, I find that there's a lot of ways to fake ghosts in photography and video. And people like, I don't know, want to believe they're seeing ghosts. And there are other things that like though a believer, I'm a very skeptical believer. And when, seeing ghost hunting footage and people are like, oh, it's an orb. I'm like, well, actually that's dust or that is a lens flare. And it's like, looking at things and being like, I can tell what that is. I'm sure there are unexplained things, but I find that according to what we're going with the soul, ghosts would definitely be able to be photographed, you would think.
Yeah. I would think so. And I mean, that's where the idea of spirit photography came from in the 1860s anyway, as well as alongside the spiritualist movement, people wanted to have pictures with their deceased loved ones. So they absolutely, at least then, believed, the people who bought the photos, not the people taking them, right? Yeah. They absolutely believed that they were capturing the soul of their deceased loved one, which, is a whole interesting psychological thing going on there.
Yeah. And that's, there's like, especially when you're dealing with the early technology of photography, there's so many ways to create fakes. And one of the most famous ones was a guy named William Mummler, who would tell people like, I don't know how these spirits are showing up in my photos, because it wouldn't, like, people would be like, is that my dad? I don't know. It's a guy. It's a man. Yeah. Maybe it is. I don't know. He died when I was young and I can't remember. But he would just produce these photos and people would be like, oh, I don't know how this is happening. Meanwhile, famous like con man P.T. Barnum was like, no, this is obviously fake. And and produced a photo of himself with like Lincoln's spirit behind him.
Love that.
So, it's like, but there was like, he got caught because he actually tried to pawn off a spirit. It was the guy's wife, the guy who had come in earlier, like a month beforehand to get her photo taken. And Mummler didn't know that he was the husband. And he put this photo in there and he's like, that's my wife. And she isn't dead.
She's alive and well.
She's alive. So he tried to skip town. He was in Boston and he went to New York, but the authorities caught him and he went on trial. But the jury didn't convict him because they said,
interesting.
They said that despite like all of the ways that people said that he could have faked this, no one saw him fake it. No one caught him red-handed. And there was an actual photographer who like sat in, like thought he was faking it and like sat in the dark room with him and said he didn't see him doing anything, but he didn't recognize the figure that came up in the photo. But everybody was like, who's to know? This technology of photography may work, it may not. They didn't convince them beyond a reasonable doubt that that he wasn't actually photographing spirits, despite people saying, well, that's my wife and she's alive. He was like, oh no, that's an evil spirit that's trying to trick you.
It's different. It's her doppelganger from, another lifetime or something. You could easily have to like swindle your way through that.
Yes. He was like, I think he said to somebody else that like when he said that their cousin or brother or someone who died in the Civil War, he produced a photo that was supposedly him, like in the photo, and he came back alive and they're like, he's not dead. He's like, oh, that was an evil spirit trying to trick you.
But that goes back to, I think, again, this really, because inherently, before I'm a monster expert, I'm a professor and a historian. So I'm fascinated by sort of the whys why things happen. And for me, I think the impetus for people wanting to believe, maybe even today, but at least with spirit photography, is there were all the wars that were happening.
Yeah.
And, people didn't see their loved ones ever again. And so I think it gave them this false sense of security. But the concept of the soul was also a hot topic in the 19th century.
Spiritualism was Ouija boards, all that stuff like that.
Yep.
The whole history of spiritualism.
Rapping.
Yes.
Yeah. 100%.
And
So I think that spirit photography was comforting because in some ways, or at least people believed, it answered that question because it proved, yes, there's an afterlife. Yes, we do have a soul. Here's a picture of it. And I think people wanted that comfort.
Yeah, people wanted to feel like they had some connection to the afterlife, some like, provable connection like that. This was like a tactile, tangible like way to bring like pierce the veil and and capture a photo of it. And as a print, they could get it printed and take it home with them, as opposed to you go to a seance and like there was no way to record a seance at that point. No video. But moving from there, one of the things I really enjoy about your show is as you mentioned, how you place monsters and their stories in the context of what that tells you about the people who tell the monster story. So my question, and not just with ghosts, and you can take this however you want, is what does our desire to document monsters or supernatural occurrences in photos or video, whatever, say about us? What does that monster story say about us as human beings?
I think the desire to have physical proof of monsters is we want monsters to be real. I think a lot of us want to believe that the world is larger than it appears. And I think that we forget sometimes with science and obviously technology, I think we have so many answers to so many different things now that were completely unobtainable hundreds, obviously thousands of years ago. So I think that having the possibility that monsters could be out there and we don't know is really intriguing. And then, of course, if evidence were to be captured, that would open up a whole new world of possibility. And cynically, it would also open up a whole new business world.
Right.
So I think that's also part of the draw too, is being not only the first to quote unquote discover evidence, but the first to capitalize on the evidence as well.
Yeah, it's always about making money as well, but that's why they have those sideshow wolf boys and things like that. People trying to capitalize on, things that are actually scientifically explainable now. But people doing that. Yeah, I think that I completely agree. It's 100% wanting the mystery. Like that there's something that's out there that's unexplained. And we want to know that it's there, but we can't explain it. So it's just, it's just like.
And I think we've been doing that for so long. I mean, before photography, before videography, I mean, there's a lot of folklore about monsters across the world that I think are inherently based in real things that happened.
Right.
So, there's, of course, the most famous one, probably werewolves, that there were, serial killers that were out there before we would identify them as mass murderers. And I think being able to say like, oh, well, you don't have a soul, or you're a werewolf, you're a vampire.
You're some kind of monster.
Exactly. It stopped people from wondering if we could also be monsters, if they could be monsters themselves. And I think it's a scary idea that humans can do such terrible things to each other. So I think that's one of the reasons we have monsters in the first place.
Well, yeah. And it's like, I mean, even Mary Shelley, being close to Lord Byron and an actual murderer probably. And, just like seeing someone, knowing someone who's, probably a sociopath and you want to like create some sort of narrative.
Exactly. And that's what Shelley did, right? I mean, her entire life was plagued by death. I mean, her mother died giving birth to her own. She lost almost all of her own children and then the love of her life. And Frankenstein was written before some of those deaths happened, but death was part of her world. And I think that that's very clearly expressed in Frankenstein.
Yeah. And it's when you look at all of the different, like we were talking about vampires, but I mean, like there's so many different types of vampires around the world. Like the Greek vampires are different than
Greek-Holocaust.
Different than Asian vampires, and there's just like there's different things that surround them. And I think that we're in the United States. I have a lot of listeners in Ireland, so don't get upset with me, Bram Stoker fans over in Ireland.
Yeah.
But like, I think that we tend to think of vampires and like that, Western, not Eastern, in that sort of Western sense of, like they're the Dracula style vampires. And it's just, like understanding our stories, like, and who we are as people. So I have a few questions.
Don't even get me started about vampire history because I could rant and rave about that for days.
I've got books. We can come back and we can talk more vampires. Yeah, one of those things that my wife was like, do you really need all these books about vampires and vampire history?
Yes.
Like, yes, I do.
Always.
That's why I kept them in a small New York apartment for years. Hey there, listeners. Do you enjoy podcasts? Of course you do. You're listening to one. But who knows? Maybe you're listening to this podcast because you're being held hostage by an interdimensional being who only plays extremely niche content to their prisoners. But if you do like podcasts, you should check out the Good Pods app. Good Pods is an award-winning podcast app that is basically the social media for podcasts. You can see what podcasts your friends are listening to, directly recommend episodes to your friends, bookmark specific episodes to listen to later, and follow and chat with your favorite podcast hosts, as well as fans of shows you like. Another great aspect of Good Pods is that they have indie-only podcast charts. As an independent podcaster myself, I can't tell you how nice it is to see your podcast actually charting when you don't have to compete with giant podcast networks with big advertising budgets or who cross-promote on hundreds of different shows. So go download the Good Pods app, find and follow The Nerdy Photographer, and leave a rating on your favorite episodes. You don't have to leave a review. Just 5 stars will do the trick. Or, if you're feeling especially generous, you can leave a little something in our tip jar over on Good Pods. That's right. We have a tip jar. I got a tip for you. Don't take any wooden nickels. And go download the Good Pods app. So I've got a few questions for you. So what is your favorite monster as a monster?
Well, probably not surprising. Anything undead, particularly zombies and vampires. Those were sort of my first monsters that really introduced me to horror as a child, and then what started my academic research in monsters. So I love the undead. I hold them very near and dear.
Don't hold a zombie too close. It might just deteriorate in your hands. Okay, so favorite monster movie then?
Oh gosh, that's a hard one.
It's hard to pick. It's really difficult.
It is hard. Off the top of my head, the first one that's coming to mind is The Mist.
Oh yeah.
That one.
The original?
Both of them. I actually liked the remake better, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah, because the ending is bleaker than the original Stephen King story, but I really like The Mist.
Oh yeah, I mean, like the at the end, that's sort of that is so horrifying at the end.
It's terrifying.
Yeah, the Thomas Jane version. I'm assuming. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's yeah. I can't.
So I would say The Mist, but then anything with Mothra in it, because Mothra is my queen and I love her.
I loved those movies when I was when I was a kid, like seeing any all the Island of Monsters, Godzilla, and the Baby Godzilla.
Yep.
I would have to say my favorite scary movie. It's really tough because I grew up probably watching movie like Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th and Halloween way too young because my sister considerably older than me. She's 8 years older than I am, and she was a teenager and loved those movies, was watching them, and I'm not even 10 and watching these films. Probably not a good time, but The Exorcist is probably it still scares me.
I've taught The Exorcist in class, and I definitely traumatized a couple of my students, but worth it. Yeah,
my wife, I do the voice.
You do?
I won't do it. It freaks her out because one time when we were first started dating, I did it when she was falling asleep, and she was like, "No."
Oh my gosh! Yeah, never again. Grounds for divorce.
You're lucky you didn't get murdered.
Exactly.
Okay, so you deal with a lot of different monsters that people probably have never heard of. What's your favorite non-traditional monster.
Oh, no question. It's the Manananggal from Filipino folklore, the segmenting, flying, blood-sucking monster. I just love, she's just so bizarre and always female. So I inherently find that very fascinating, and definitely the Manananggal.
Yeah, that's well, the name alone is just the
yes.
Hey. And now for my favorite part of the show. What's that say? Useless information.
All right, so we're going to wrap up. And I always wrap up every episode with a little bit of useless information.
Love it.
Yeah, just because I'm an encyclopedia of useless knowledge. So kind of keeping with our topic, this is about bats. Bats, see the world through echolocation. But how did we find out that bats use echolocation? In 1793, Lazzaro Spallanzani, I'm trying to created an experiment. I don't, have you heard of this?
I know exactly. No, but I know who he is. Yeah.
He noticed that when he blew a candle out, the bats flew around the room without bumping into anything. So he was like, I wonder how they are doing that. So a few days later, he took 2 bats and he blindfolded them.
Oh, that must have been challenging.
Yeah. Apparently he made like little opaque discs out of lime and just put them over their eyes. So he blindfolds them and lets the bats go. And he realizes like they're doing just fine. They're not bumping, not bumping into anything. So they must not use their eyes to navigate. So what did he do next? He made earplugs.
Oh my gosh.
He plugged the bats' ears and they were slamming into stuff, bumping into things. So obviously they used sound to navigate.
There you go. Science made.
Yeah. Dr. Zarka, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate you coming on. Maybe we'll find something in the future. You can come on again. Can you let people know where they can find your show?
Sure. You can find Monstrum on YouTube, on the Storied channel, and also on pbs.org.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome back, everybody. Many thanks to Dr. Emily Zarka for being on the podcast. I had a fantastic nerdy time talking monsters with her. You can search for her series Monstrum on YouTube and on the PBS website. It's awesome. You should definitely be watching it. And you can also follow her on Twitter at Zarka Emily. If you enjoyed this episode, I hope you subscribe to the Nerdy Photographer Podcast. Leave us a review or even tell someone you know or someone you don't know about the podcast. You can also follow along with the Nerdy Photographer on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at the Nerdy Photo. Fun stuff happening on the social channels in between episodes. Go check them out. I hope you were pleasantly spooked by our spooky season episodes as well. I enjoy putting together content like this for you, my dear listeners.
Abracadabra, I am a space vampire.
Abracadabra, I'm a photographer. The shoot isn't going to end unless you pick on a form you want photographed, Orlo.
Hocus pocus, I am a space bat.
It's all just hocus pocus. Until next time, everybody, stay safe and stay nerdy.
Who's that coming back to town? You better start listening. Who's your heart been beating about? You better listen.